Did Brexit accidentally break the British Union? The trade deals that ruined Britain. There's a boardroom in Brussels on the morning of January 31st, 2020, where the mood is not triumphant. It is clinical. The European Union's negotiators are not celebrating Britain's departure. They are updating spreadsheets. They are calculating tariff schedules and trade quotas and customs protocols. They know what the British politicians have refused to accept. This is not about flags or sovereignty or history. This is about balance sheets. And the British balance sheet is about to bleed. We've been told that Brexit was about taking back control, about rejecting bureaucracy, about becoming a global trading nation once again. But here's the truth that no one wanted to say out loud. Brexit was not a liberation. It was a liquidation sale. Britain did not leave Europe to become stronger. It left because it believed a delusion written in the ink of empire, and that delusion is now bankrupting the nation. The illusion was magnificent. Picture London in 2015, before the referendum vote tore everything apart. The city gleams like a jewel box. Glass towers rise above the Thames. Bankers from every continent flood into Canary Wharf every morning. The stock exchange hums with transactions measured in billions. Britain is the fifth largest economy on Earth. It has nuclear weapons and a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. It has universities that educate the world's elite. Its cultural exports dominate global screens and speakers. James Bond and Harry Potter and Adele and the Premier League. This is a nation that still carries weight. It still commands respect. Its passport opens every door. Its capital city is a node in a global network of power and money. But beneath the surface, beneath the pomp and the ceremony, the foundation is rotting. The economy is built on a platform that Britain's leaders refuse to acknowledge. That platform is Europe. For 40 years, Britain has been part of the largest single market in human history. Nearly half of all British exports flow into the European Union without friction, without tariffs, without paperwork. British factories send components to German assembly lines. British farmers sell beef to French supermarkets. British lawyers advise Italian corporations. The supply chains are so deeply integrated that you cannot separate them without causing hemorrhaging. But the British political class has an addiction to exceptionalism. They believe that Britain is special, that the rules of gravity and geography do not apply. They look at the map and they see not 21 miles of cold water separating them from France. They see an ocean protecting them from contamination. They see themselves as separate, as different, as superior. This belief is encoded in every institution. It is in the way politicians speak about Europe with barely concealed contempt. It is in the tabloid headlines that blame Brussels for every inconvenience. It is in the constant invocation of the Second World War, as if Britain won that war alone. The economic trap was set decades before the referendum. Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973, but it never truly committed. It kept the pound sterling while others adopted the euro. It stayed out of the Schengen zone while others opened their borders. It demanded rebates and exemptions and special treatment. It was the teenager at the family table, always complaining, always threatening to leave. And the tabloids fed this narrative with religious devotion. For years, British newspapers ran stories about the EU banning curved bananas and regulating the shape of cucumbers. These stories were fabrications or grotesque exaggerations. But they built a narrative. They built the idea that Britain was being strangled by foreign bureaucrats, that British freedom was being stolen by unelected technocrats in Belgium. This was the addiction to believing that Britain was being held back, that if only the chains could be broken, Britain would soar. The architects of Brexit understood this psychology perfectly. Men like Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage and Daniel Hannan. They painted a seductive picture. They said Europe was a corpse, a dying continent of unemployment and stagnation. They said the future was out there in the dynamic markets of Asia and America. They promised that countries were lining up to sign trade deals with Britain. They promised that German car manufacturers needed Britain more than Britain needed them. They said Britain held all the cards. Michael Gove stood in front of cameras and said Britain had had enough of experts. The implication was clear. Don't trust the economists with their warnings and their graphs. Trust your feelings. Trust your instincts. Trust the memory of empire. This was the fatal flaw. They confused nostalgia with strategy. They confused sentiment with economics. They thought that because Britain had once ruled a quarter of the earth, it could still dictate terms to the world. The descent began the moment the votes were counted on June 23, 2016. 52% voted to leave. 48% voted to remain. The margin was razor thin. But the decision was absolute. Britain would leave the European Union. The pound sterling collapsed immediately. It dropped 15% against the dollar in a matter of hours. Foreign investors pulled billions out of British assets. The Bank of England had to intervene to stabilize the currency. But the government celebrated. They said this was democracy in action. They said this was the will of the people. What they did not say is that the will of the people had just cost the economy £300 billion in lost investment. The government had to negotiate an exit. They had to untangle 40 years of legal and economic integration. They had to replace hundreds of trade agreements that Britain had enjoyed as part of the EU, and they had no plan. Theresa May became Prime Minister in July 2016 with a mandate to deliver Brexit. She walked into negotiations with the EU believing that Britain's historical importance would carry weight. She was wrong. The EU negotiators were cold and methodical. They had no interest in giving Britain a sweetheart deal. To do so would encourage every other member state with grievances to threaten exit. The integrity of the Union was more important than selling a few thousand cars to Britain. The Europeans laid out their terms. Britain could have access to the single market only if it accepted the 4 freedoms: free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. Britain refused. The Brexiteers had promised to end immigration from Europe. They could not accept free movement. So the Europeans said fine, no single market access. Britain would trade with Europe like any other third country. Tariffs and quotas and customs checks. The frictionless trade was over. The first cold shower came from the United States. The Americans were supposed to be Britain's savior. The special relationship was supposed to deliver a massive trade deal. But the Americans are not sentimental. They saw an opportunity. They saw a desperate nation. And they twisted the knife. The U.S. Trade Representative demanded that Britain lower its food safety standards. They wanted chlorinated chicken and hormone-treated beef to flood British supermarkets. They wanted American pharmaceutical companies to have access to the National Health Service. They wanted to bid for contracts in British hospitals. The British public was horrified. The NHS is sacred. The idea of American corporations running emergency rooms was an abomination, but the Americans did not care. They told Britain to wait. There were bigger priorities. Renegotiating NAFTA, the trade war with China. Britain could wait in the lobby. Then Joe Biden was elected in November 2020. Biden was of Irish descent. He cared deeply about the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. He saw Brexit as a threat to the fragile peace. He did not view Brexit as brave. He viewed it as reckless. When Boris Johnson visited the White House, he was told to stand at the back of the queue. Barack Obama had warned this would happen during the referendum campaign. The warning had been dismissed as Project Fear. Now it was reality. The great American trade deal vanished. Today there is no U.S. trade deal. There is not even a negotiation. The talks have been shelved indefinitely. Britain bet the house on America, and America shrugged. So the government looked to Australia. Australia seemed perfect, a Commonwealth nation, English-speaking. The Queen on the money, shared history and culture. It seemed like an easy win. The government rushed the negotiation. They needed a victory. They needed something to wave at the cameras. But the Australians are not sentimental either. They are tough negotiators. They saw the desperation, and they exploited it ruthlessly. The deal signed in December 2021 was a capitulation. Britain agreed to remove all tariffs and quotas on Australian beef and lamb over 15 years. Australian farmers could flood the British market with cheap meat produced on the other side of the planet. British farmers were outraged. They said this would destroy their industry. They pointed out that Australian farms are the size of small countries, industrial-scale operations with none of the environmental constraints that British farmers face. The government did not care. They needed the headline. When the economists ran the numbers, the results were pathetic. The government's own impact assessment admitted that the Australia trade deal would increase British GDP by 0.08%. Not 8%. Not even 0.8%. 0.08%. Over 15 years. It was a rounding error. It was economic noise. The government had sold out British farmers for a gain so small it could barely be measured. It was insanity dressed up as victory. But the humiliation did not stop. Economists have a principle called the gravity model of trade. It is simple and it is brutal. Countries trade most with their neighbors. Trade falls as distance increases. This is not ideology. This is physics. It is cheaper and faster to send a truck from London to Paris than a container ship from London to Sydney. The truck takes hours. The ship takes 6 weeks. Fresh food does not survive 6 weeks at sea. Before Brexit, nearly 50% of British exports went to the European Union. After Brexit, that share began to decline as friction and paperwork made trade harder. Britain was trying to replace a customer next door who bought half its goods with customers on the other side of the planet who bought 2%. The math did not work. You cannot defeat geography. You cannot will away the miles. The distance from London to Sydney is 10,500 miles. The distance from London to Paris is 214 miles. This is not a small difference. This is a civilizational difference. The Brexiteers tried to argue that distance did not matter in the Internet age. They said Britain is a service economy now. Financial services and legal services and ideas travel at the speed of light. Geography is irrelevant. But you cannot eat an idea. You cannot drive a service. A huge part of the economy is still physical goods, cars and medicines and machinery and food. And physical goods need to move. Then there was the illusion of China. David Cameron had declared a golden era of relations with China in 2015. He rolled out the red carpet for President Xi Jinping. They drank beer together in a pub. It was a photo opportunity meant to show that Britain would be China's best partner in the West. Chinese money would build British infrastructure, nuclear power plants and high-speed rail. London would be the gateway for Chinese investment into Europe. But geopolitics moved fast. By the time Britain left the EU on January 31, 2020, the world had changed. The crackdown on pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong shocked the world. The revelations about detention camps in Xinjiang, the evidence that Huawei was a potential espionage vehicle. Suddenly, China was toxic. The golden era was dead. Britain was caught in a trap. The United States demanded that Britain ban Huawei from its 5G network. The Conservative Party turned hawkish overnight. Ministers who had been photographed with Chinese officials were now giving speeches about authoritarian capitalism. It was embarrassing. But Britain could not afford to antagonize America, so Britain banned Huawei. It ripped out Chinese equipment at enormous cost. It joined the new Cold War against Beijing, and in doing so it closed off the Chinese market. Britain had lost Europe. It had been rejected by America, and it was now in a Cold War with China. The three biggest economic blocs in the world were effectively closed off or difficult to access. This is the definition of isolation. This is what it looks like when your strategy collapses. And in this isolation, the government realized something terrifying. It had lost the muscle memory of how to negotiate. For 40 years, all trade deals were negotiated by the European Union. Brussels had a massive team of lawyers and economists who spent their entire careers doing nothing but trade negotiations. They negotiated for 500 million people. When they walked into a room with Japan or Canada, they had the weight of the world's biggest market behind them. Britain had to build a trade department from scratch. It had to hire consultants from law firms. It had to bring in people who had never done a big international deal before. They were learning on the job, and the countries on the other side of the table knew it. Japan is a polite country, but when Britain came asking for a new trade deal, Japan simply said, "Cut and paste. Here's the deal we have with the EU. You can have the same terms, but you cannot have better terms. You are a smaller market now. You have less leverage. Take it or leave it." Britain had to accept. They signed the Japan deal in October 2020 and celebrated it as a victory. Boris Johnson stood at a podium and said this proved Brexit was working. But it was just a photocopy of the deal Britain already had inside the EU. In fact, it was slightly worse. Under the rules of origin, Britain could no longer count Japanese car parts as British for the purposes of exporting to Europe. This seemingly technical detail had real consequences for British car factories. This pattern repeated everywhere: Canada, South Korea, Mexico. Britain was running around the world trying to replicate the access it had lost. It was running to stand still, and often it was slipping backwards. The Brexiteers had promised that Britain would be a rule maker. They said that inside the EU, Britain was forced to follow regulations written by unelected bureaucrats. They said that outside the EU, Britain would set the standards for the world. Britain would be a regulatory superpower. Other countries would adopt British standards because they were the best. In reality, Britain became a rule-taker, the hard truth that no one wanted to admit. When you are a market of 65 million people dealing with a market of 300 million or 500 million, you do not set the rules. You follow them. If a British company wants to sell to the United States, it follows U.S. rules. If it wants to sell to the EU, it follows EU rules. If it wants to sell to China, it follows Chinese rules. Before Brexit, Britain had a seat at the table in Brussels where the EU rules were made. It could veto things it did not like. It could shape the regulations. Now Britain was outside the room. It had to follow the rules to sell its goods, but it had no voice in writing them. This is the opposite of sovereignty. This is subservience. The delusion of empire was based on the idea that Britain was still a great power. A great power dictates terms. A great power has leverage. But the painful lesson of the last few years is that Britain is a medium power. It is a rich country. It has a strong military. It has cultural influence. But economically, it is not a titan. It is not America or China. It is not even the European Union, and the world is moving towards blocks. The U.S. is a bloc, the EU is a bloc, China is a bloc. These giants are fighting for dominance. They are subsidizing industries. They are protecting markets. They are using economic power as a geopolitical weapon. In a world of giants, it is dangerous to be alone. The Brexiteers thought they were setting sail on a nimble speedboat. Instead, they cast off from the mother ship in a rubber dinghy just as a storm was rolling in.